everyone, and welcome to today's event. My name is Dr. Eleni Michalopoulou, and I am a researcher for the Stockholm Environment Institute with the Department of Environment and Geography in the University of York. Today we are going to be discussing one of the sessions of the York Festival of Ideas, which this year is celebrating its 10-year anniversary. And today's session is called Forecast, a Diary of the Lost Seasons. And we will be joined very shortly by Joe Shute, who will be talking to us about his new book. Before we start, just a couple of technical notes. If you are watching live, you can use the Q&A function on your screen to ask questions. This is going to be available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. We will make one more note about this once we start our discussion with Joe. If you have any technical issues, if you lose your internet connection, please rejoin the event using the original link. And remember that today's event is going to be recorded, so you will be able to watch it again. There are subtitles available in this event, and you can turn these on or off using the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. I am now going to ask Joe to join us, and I will be giving a quick introduction. So hopefully Joe is here with us, and yes, there we are. Hi.
Hi.
So, hi, Joe. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to give you a very quick introduction, and then we can go straight into discussing. So Joe Shute, who has just joined us, is an author and journalist with a passion for the natural world. He has studied history at the University of Leeds and currently works as a senior staff feature writer at The Telegraph. Before joining the newspaper, Joe was the crime correspondent for the Yorkshire Post, and he's the author of A Shadow Above and Forecast. Joe, thank you very, very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
I think it would be really great, fantastic. I'm so sorry, I might be lagging a little bit, so if I'm interrupting you, I do apologize. There's absolutely no intention to do that. So, Joe, would you like to start by telling us some more about yourself and your background as a journalist?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be at the York Festival of Ideas, and really for me is a lot of where I started as a journalist. It was the Halifax Evening Courier first, and then I moved to the Yorkshire Post, and for quite some time I was based in the York office of the Yorkshire Post, actually, which sadly doesn't exist anymore, and I was a district reporter covering North Yorkshire. I moved from there to the Daily Telegraph, where I've worked as a journalist for the past 8 years now, and for all that time I've written a weather column for the paper, which is called Weather Watch and appears every Saturday, and it's a small column, only a few hundred words. It existed long before my time at the Telegraph, and it will exist long after I leave, I'm sure. And the idea of the column, my editors told me when I first started was, and it was a slightly cryptic instruction really for a column that was called Weather Watch, but it was to write about anything but the weather. And also, whatever you do, don't try and forecast anything. And I fell very foul of that on my first ever column, actually. And I looked at the weather map of Britain, and it looked a rare weekend, especially given recent weather, where it was just beautiful sunshine all over the British Isles. So apart from right in the north of Britain, over Shetland, you could see one of those kind of rainy sort of images. So I said in the column, oh, you know, everywhere was glorious weather apart from Shetland. And a few days later, I received a letter of complaint, and it was from a reader living in Balta Sound on Shetland, an island called Unst, I think, off the top of my head. And he'd written this very careful letter to me saying how he'd only read my column on Monday because the Telegraph takes some time to be shipped up there, and it lands at his in the local shop and gets delivered to him. So he'd only got round to it there. But he was furious that I'd said it was going to be sunny there when it was quite the opposite. He also invited me to come up and visit him sometime and in the future. But really that letter set the tone for what the past 8 years of this column have been about, really. And that's writing about how the weather sort of makes us feel, writing about the history of the weather, this incredible, rich array of folklore we have in Britain that's attached to the weather, and above all, receiving people's memories and experiences as well. I've had so many letters from readers over the years that I've got a huge folder in my study that's just full of these. And it's people writing about their own different sort of, their tiny kind of weather systems, just, above their house, how strange things are happening, flowers coming out at wrong times, seeing different birds when previously they wouldn't see them. And really that fed into the idea of what the book is about. And it's about, we hear and read about climate change as this kind of abstract thing that for many people, myself included, is very difficult to grasp. We see the most extreme end of it, of wildfires and floods and kind of record droughts and all the rest. But these letters I was receiving was all about how climate change is changing people's everyday, and how it's changing the passage of the seasons in everybody's minds as well. So I decided to put that into a book, and I received finished copies just a few days ago, actually. So here it is.
Can I just make a couple of comments on what you just said, and also link it to the instruction we have for the audience to ask their questions in the Q&A box. So I would feel, so because Joe's book is very personal, and we will get to that as well, and because you are sharing all of your experiences, I think it would be great to carry on that tradition that started with the letters that you are receiving for the Weather Watch column that you're writing, and perhaps the audience can also, as we speak and as we are together for the next 50 minutes, perhaps you can also share your own experiences, your own thoughts, your own memories about what you hear in the discussion today and about the weather or climate. So you actually caught my next question, which was going to be about the motivation between writing your book. And because you slightly answered it already, I'm just going to modify it a little bit. And I'm going to ask, you speak in your book of a journey. How has that journey made you feel? Because that journey, it transcended space. It transcended time. So it's a very special, it's a very personal kind of journey. So how did you experience that while you were writing the book?
I suppose it sort of really cemented in my mind how the weather is personal for everybody. We talk particularly in Britain, we have such extraordinary sort of diversity of weather. We've lost so much diversity of our nature and everything else, but our weather is still as diverse as it gets. We're a rainforest of it. And I think in this country particularly, we talk about our weather. I'm sure it's the same in Corfu, for example, where you're from, Eleni, and elsewhere. I'm sure it's people see it as their weather. And I think that kind of that sort of personal attachment to it really cemented in my mind how that sort of changes as you go across the country, and also the way in which the weather, and I write about this quite a lot in the book, how the weather shapes our memories and it shapes our lives. We reflect back on the sort of the weather of our childhoods, and the sort of, when we're talking about climate change, the pitfalls of that, because when you remember something, your memories, you can never quite trust them. And we remember the weather always as, perfect 4 seasons. We remember snowy winter days, and we remember glorious sort of sunny days as kids running around in the park, and those kind of days of startling autumn colour. And actually that kind of muddies all the sort of washouts and dreary summers and all the rest along the way as well. So I tried to, in the book, as I was sort of going through that journey, to unpick a bit of that nostalgia as well, and try and get the kind of evidence of what is changing, why is it changing, and the impact on nature and the natural world, and also the impact on us as well.
I think that there are so many interesting themes throughout the book, and some of them are cross-cutting. No, Joe, your book made me cry, and Genuinely. I will explain why, because this is, I mean, in one of the sentences you say that you're going to talk about landscape and the weather and memory and nostalgia, like you just said. And knowing that, I started like thinking back in my own memories. But those memories are not at a place that I visit often, just because of how life is, just because of, we work, we do the things, and then we carry on with our days. But I think that something that I found very interesting throughout the book is there's a sense of bravery, revisiting those memories, or your own, or the people that shared those memories with you. Could you just give us like a sense of how people react when they're talking about the weather, especially when they are linking it to their own memories?
I mean, for the people, thank you first of all for such kind words about the book. That's lovely, and I'm really appreciate so, and I'm glad it touched a nerve. I guess from the book, it really went from, on one level, the very sort of practical aspect of those memories. For example, I live in Sheffield and spent a lot of time with a farmer in the Peak District called John Elliott, and John is a cattle farmer. And his family have owned land around Hathers's Edge for centuries, and he still farms that same land now. And he does so in a very traditional way. He presides over these traditional ancient hay meadows, which sadly are a sort of vanishingly or increasingly rare habitat around the country. We've lost over 90% of them since the Second World War due to sort of modern farming techniques and the pressure that is put on farmers to create ever sort of cheaper, more abundant food. John has rejected those sorts of modern farming techniques and still farms in many ways in the old way. I met him by complete accident. I was cycling through the Peak District one day, and I came across this incredible scene of John and his 4 sons, who range from mid-20s to about 11, all in their own tractors, sort of very tiny Massey Ferguson tractors, just going up and down, and baling all the hay up themselves, or having sandwiches in the field. And above them, it was a sort of beautiful scene. It belonged in an Eric Ravilius painting or someone like that. And you could see swifts flying over and gobbling up the insects that were sort of drifting up in the wake of it. And I just went and introduced myself to him, and we spent quite a lot of time together since then. But he spoke of his weather memories on a sort of practical level. When the summer that we met was 2018, and that was, you may remember, the summer when there was a huge drought across the north. Lady Bower Reservoir, which is very close to his land, had dried up so much that a flooded village at the bottom of it, when the reservoir was built in the Second World War, the ruins of that village began to appear through the water, and it became a sort of climate tourist attraction in its own right. And John talked about the pressures of that. He could remember when the weather wasn't like that, when the weather could be relied upon, and the sort of agricultural practices he developed in response to that. And now, what he was experiencing, he'd never seen anything like it. And then there was the more kind of, there were, I met gardeners, for example, in stately homes who, because of their position, there was another, was just over the border in Derbyshire, actually, a stately home called Renishaw Hall. And there was a man I met there called David Kestevan. He'd been the head gardener there for 20 years. And when we think of a scientific study, and it's the same with all the Weather Watch readers, and I'm sure people watching today will have this as well, who've lived in their houses for a long time and have a garden, however small. You watch that through the seasons every year, and it creates a sort of scientific study in its own right. And David was telling me in Renishaw Hall, the crocuses that when he first started would appear in February were now coming up into bloom before Christmas. Every year they have a bluebell festival that used to take place in mid-May, and now again that's happening at the beginning of April as well. And that's that kind of how those memories are sort of playing out in the landscape as well.
Thank you. That's That's very interesting. I am going to link what you are saying to a first comment we got from our audience. So the comment says, I wonder if the weather is such an obsession for people in other countries. And I'm asking this question now because you do mention some of your travels that go beyond the UK in your book. And the rest of the comment, the question is, it seems an endless topic of discussion in the UK. Why do you think we're so endlessly talking about the weather? Before you answer, I think the reason why I would like to weave it into the discussion as it's unfolding right now is because you said, I'm sure it's the same in Corfu and in Greece, and there's this how you feel that connection with the weather. So when I first arrived in the UK, which is now 6 years ago, there was a very specific day with a very specific thick drizzle, and I didn't have the word for it. All I could describe it as was just this humidity standing in the air, or like raindrops just hovering in the air. But in the in our work with our colleagues, it is a very frequent topic of discussion. Why do you think that is happening?
Did you find out the word for that specific drizzle?
No.
Yeah, this was a sort of part of my research for the book. So I will get onto the other questions, but just to get onto that first is this came up last week with the G7, and they'd all gathered in Cornwall, and Boris Johnson and Joe Biden had plans to go out to St. Michael's Mount, I think it's called, which is this little island off the mainland, to go and sort of do a photo up there. And exactly the weather you're describing blew in off the Atlantic and cancelled the trip. And that in Cornish is known as mizzle. And that exact type of weather has different names for it all over the country. And we have these amazing regional dialects for weather, for really, exactly as you say, really precise weather events, which sadly are at kind of risk of dying out as it becomes a more homogenized thing. But that was just a sort of aside. I was interested in that. As for my travels and how other countries relate to the weather, it's in terms of I write a lot in the book about an experience I had out in the Sahel in Africa, which was as part of a story I was doing for the Telegraph magazine. And it was all about how it is plans to build something called the Great Green Wall, which is basically a mass of trees from the west coast of Africa all the way to the east coast, involving over a dozen countries, much more. And the idea was these trees would provide a sort of barrier to the Sahara Desert, which is increasingly encroaching on all the countries that sort of run along that belt, and create sort of mini ecosystems, create sort of livelihoods for people, and yeah, sort of almost like a sort of a shield against what is coming. In parts of where that's being planted, it's working. We went to Senegal, where the trees are really changing the weather, and locally, creating locally much more rainfall and so on, and also providing sort of income for villagers as well. They're able to grow crops and so on. But there's other countries, particularly as I write about in the book, in Chad, around Lake Chad, which is part of where the Great Green Wall is hoped to be. And you see the way the weather has changed there. And it's already costing huge amounts of damage and affecting so many people's lives. It's feeding into instability. It's feeding into the terror group who are then running around the lake while we were there, Boko Haram, and people who would be reliant on the kind of, there'd be two seasons there. You'd have the wet season and the dry season. And the dry season is increasingly hotter. And the wet season, the rains just aren't coming at all. And that's the real sharp end of climate change. And also, hugely unfairly is being brought upon the people with the smallest carbon footprint of all. The kind of the villagers around Lake Chad, they don't take flights and do everything that all the rest of us do as well. So yeah, in terms of that kind of sort of association with the weather and the strength of feeding on the weather is huge there, of course. Culture-wise, it's tough because I think to really understand your own sort of country's cultural attachment to the weather, it really helps to be part of that country to begin with. But I hope that answers it.
Thank you. If it doesn't, please, whoever the member of the audience who posted that, please feel free to post another question or a follow-up comment. There are so many things I want to ask you about and I want to talk to you about. And also, I was very aware that, again, because you are sharing those experiences, some very personal ones, and because we've also asked the audience to share their experiences, if they are happy to do that, I would also like to share one memory of mine that came to mind when I was reading your book, and it links to one of the key words. So, for the benefit of our audience, I am Greek. I grew up in Athens, but I come from Corfu. And some months ago, there was a fire in Corfu, and it burned a forest. So when I heard of the news of the fire that burned the forest, my first reaction was not just about the forest. It was very strange, because my first reaction was that, because my first memory of that forest was related to my father, and my father has now passed away. So my first reaction was that this was a piece of memory that related to my father that was now taken away from me. And in that forest, I had seen my first fireflies. In my memory, which I'm very aware that is a false memory, the whole forest was filled with fireflies. I'm pretty sure it was just a couple of them. However, you do mention a very specific word in your book that relates to that. I hope I will pronounce that correctly. So that word is solastalgia. Would you like to tell us about that word and what it means and why it's really important for people to know this word?
Yeah. So solastalgia, it was a word that was coined by an Australian academic, a man called Glenn Albrecht. And he invented it at about 15 or so years ago now. And he did it, he coined the word particularly with regard to open cast coal mining in Australia. He was doing a lot of research there and touring communities, talking to them about how the way the landscape was being kind of ripped open around where they were living and how that was impacting on their lives. And it's a phrase which can be sort of increasingly applied to environmental disasters, exactly like that really harrowing one you just described, Elenia. Because nostalgia is a word which we sort of think of as something we can return back to, something which still exists maybe, The difference with solastalgia is it's lamenting something that has already passed and there's no way of going back to it. So it applies to a favorite forest that's been chopped down, or a village that's been sort of turned into a coal mine, or a weather event or a season which increasingly is looking like it won't happen again. There was a Met Office report out just a few months ago about snow in Britain and how they'd mapped, if global temperatures were going to keep increasing as they are doing, what would happen to snowy winters in Britain. And the report found by about 2060, I think, for many parts of the country, we wouldn't see any snow at all anymore in winter. So solastalgia would apply to that, because there'd be no way of, it would be different to nostalgia in that sense. So I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. We do have one question about how the word is spelled. I promise I will type the answer in 5 or 10 minutes if that's okay. I would like to...
I thought you were going to put me to a terrible test there.
No. And also, just to be safe, because of my accent, I wouldn't want to just misspell the word. I think something that's very, again, personal and extremely interesting in the book is you also describe your companionship with your wife, Liz. And I think that the way this is linked to the stories and linked to the book, it gives it not just a more personal touch, but I think it just gives it, how can I explain this? So we often get asked by, as climate scientists, we often get asked by people, how are they supposed to feel about climate change, or how they are supposed to overcome it emotionally? How can they deal with the emotions that this creates? Would you like to share some words about companionship, but also those sentiments that can occur from experiencing these changes and the extreme events, or the weather change or the climate change?
I didn't mean for initially, when I started writing this book, for it to be in any way a particularly personal book. Much with my last one, I intended it to be primarily, and I hope it still is primarily, a journalistic book of, going out, talking to people, gathering other people's experiences, doing your own research. What slightly changed that is, during the course of writing it, my wife and I, Liz, we've been trying to have a kid for a number of years, and for various reasons that wasn't happening. And when you study the seasons and when you study the kind of passage of the year, so much of it is about fertility and death and renewal and new life and so on. And particularly as doing kind of practicing the art of phenology, which I write a lot about in the book. I say art science is probably a better word for it, which is used by naturalists to mark the passage of the seasons. So exactly when birds are nesting, exactly when those chicks are hatching from their eggs and beginning to fledge, exactly when the first flowers and the first fruits appear and so on. So it was this kind of strange situation I found myself in, where on one level, out in nature, I'm watching this constant cycle of renewal going on, a new life, abounding around me all the time, while on a personal level, we were struggling to create the new life of our own. And it really sharpened for me the awareness of what I was seeing out in nature, and what I was seeing in terms of how the climate change was impacting on the natural world as well. So I wanted to include that in the book as a way of making it relevant for readers. As you say, or as you said from the outset there, Eleni, it's something that's really important to do, and I've tried to do this over the years in my weather column, is not bang on about climate change in a way, but also continually banging on about climate change. But you need to keep people reading what you write. You need to keep people reading the papers you produce and watching things like this. And by doing that, you need to make things relevant to people. And I really hoped that would help sort of put the book in a bit of focus. And also, on an entirely separate level, I also hope that it could help other couples going through what we've been going through as well, because infertility is a really tough thing to deal with for anybody. And it's not something that gets spoken about very often. There's a kind of shame attached to it on an individual level and on a sort of for couples themselves. And I wanted to kind of break through that a little bit as well. So that was my rationale for including those bits.
I think it was amazingly put together in the book, and as you said, there's perhaps a level of shame or guilt, and these were very interesting parallels between climate change and weather change, and as you said about fertility and the level of fault that you talk about in the book. You're saying that it's not our fault, it's a thing, and we need to look at it like that. And I would like to go to one of the questions from our audience, because it's very relevant to what you just said. The question is, do you think we emphasize our relationship to the weather enough when talking about climate change in the media? This talk has made me realize it feels woven into our lives on a much deeper level than I thought before.
Thank you. That's a very nice comment, and I'm glad it has. And no, absolutely, I don't think we do enough. I think it's obviously weather and climate are different things, but I think that it's spoken about in far too abstract a sense. and far too kind of, even though it is a, impending catastrophe, far too catastrophic sense as well, without constantly sort of telling people the small things, we can all do to help creatures, wildlife that's struggling with, struggling to adapt to these new sorts of rhythms of the year. I think, and it's something I bang on about a lot in my columns and mention in the book as well. I think we are sort of, we're at risk of, it's just a sort of natural progression of the past few hundred years and the way our society has changed, where, as I mentioned, the weather words earlier on, the mizzle and so on, we used to have these very distinct kind of vocabularies for the weather between different communities. And because of the nature of the work people did back then, a much greater attachment to the weather as well, because, it was quite literally, in the way it is now in places like Lake Chad, a matter of life and death if you had too many failed harvests and so on in the UK as anywhere else in the world. Communities would die. So there was this real sort of strength of folklore. As the sort of modern life has led to increasing urbanization and a sort of drain of young people leaving towns and villages, moving into cities. Those same towns and villages then being taken over by second homeowners and everything like that. And all the kind of, normal passage of the way society goes now. We're at risk of losing a lot of that folklore and a lot of that kind of personal connection to the weather. And I write about that in terms of the language we use to describe it. What's replaced those very specific weather words is a much more sort of kind of shock reporting about the weather that you see now. We see monster storms and hellish downpours and all that kind of stuff. And that builds a sort of a kind of divide between us and the weather and describes it as a more attritional relationship. The weather is something which has gone from our weather to something which is now sort of wreaking its revenge on us, really, when the way some of these sorts of extreme weather events are described. And I really think we need to get back to that kind of, to understand that history and the way that so much of our culture is sort of entwined with that. I really think that will help us make sense of what lies ahead.
So can I ask, we spoke about solastalgia, and we keep getting questions. Thank you so much for your questions. I will return to them. But I would also like to explore with you a little bit nostalgia. And you do refer to it as your national sport. So could you just expand on that a little bit? And also perhaps even on a more personal level, not just as your national sport.
I said one of two national sports, and then the other one is happening tonight against Scotland. But it's just important. And we're actually much better at nostalgia than we are at football as well.
I've made no such comment.
I mean, I think it underpins so much. I think it underpins so much of kind of our character in this country. And in terms of the weather, it leads to a real sort of a kind of we can lie to ourselves, really. Nostalgia is a great tool of deception. And I mentioned the kind of perfect nostalgic interpretation of the seasons in the book, which was, to me, written by T.H. White in The Once and Future King. And he talks of the forest sauvage where Merlin lives as this place of kind of, the perfect four seasons, and summer sort of drifts in on wildflowers and bright blue skies every day, and winter, the snow is beautifully iced and stuff. And of course, the weather's, and I've tried to be careful with this in the book, is the weather in Britain has never been perfect. We live on a sort of rain-lashed isle somewhere off mainland Europe that are kind of battered by Atlantic storms and then whatever kind of comes our way from the Arctic and elsewhere. And the weather's always been cyclical here. And we've had things like Little Ice Age before as well, which is, led to kind of centuries of huge disruption. The 17th century in particular was temperatures overall fell by about 2 degrees, which is roughly where we're heading upwards now with climate change, obviously. And the impact was huge on Britain as all over the Northern Hemisphere. Harvests failed, there were riots, it's never been this perfect thing. And I think I wanted to be careful with that in the book, because I think it becomes a bit disingenuous if you say, for thousands of years, Britain has always sort of basked in 4 perfect seasons, and suddenly, because of climate change, that's all getting mixed up. That's not the case. The difference is, and what I hope to sort of show in the book, is that pace of change and the kind of attribution of that change as well has never happened in human history, at least, where we can see on the charts, we can see on the sort of weather patterns exactly what we're doing and exactly how that is being sort of fed back to us through the climate and through weather as well. I mention in the book as a way of sort of understanding that a weather station. We're blessed in this country with weather stations all over the British Isles that have been in operation for over 100 years. Some of them. One of the very oldest ones is actually in my home city in Sheffield, the Western Park Weather Station. And it was set up in the, I think, early 1880s. And initially, they were having a lot of kind of cholera outbreaks in the city, and they didn't know why. So they built this weather station to try and see if there was some link between the weather and people's health. And it was manned by a guy originally called, or he's nicknamed Elijah the Prophet locally, because he had these kind of newfangled machines that would tell people what the weather was going to do the next day ahead. It wasn't very accurate, but all the same, he was known as the prophet. And ever since, that weather station has been in operation. And for the book, I went to meet the current curator of it. It's owned by Sheffield Museums, the weather station, but it still works. It's still an official Met Office station. And I interviewed the curator of that, who took over, when he first took over 20 odd years ago, they were still recording it in the same old leather-bound ledgers that Elijah the Prophet would have done it in a century previously, and going out in, snow, rain, whatever, to do these sort of, write down these observations. But what it provides us with is 140 odd years of solid data over that time. And that data shows cyclical. It shows, 10, 20 year periods that are rainier and drier, and the weather goes up and down. It's never been set. But what it also shows is that in the past 20, 30 years, those extreme weather events are getting increasingly more common and causing increasing more destruction as well. Just 2 years ago, in November 2019, which some people may remember, was when Fish Lake in Doncaster flooded catastrophically. That was according to the Western Park Weather Station, the rainiest November in Sheffield ever. And now it's notching up those records on a kind of a very regular basis.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pick on one word that you said, because you said health. And we have one question in the chat. And the question is, have you looked at the links between the weather and seasons and people's mood, mental health?
I did for the book. And I sort of went back a bit further to begin with in the research, because there's this amazing I mentioned the Little Ice Age of the 17th century. Around that time, there really began to be this big network of doctors, scientists examining the link between weather and health. And some of the diaries are fascinating. And there was the kind of how the weather influenced human physical health to begin with was thought to be huge. And, doctors would, between the autumn solstice and autumn equinox and the winter solstice every year, would recommend that people would drain their bloods, a pint or so of blood to prevent you from the sort of incoming darkness, to protect you against that in some way. Frosts were thought to be a good thing because they'd seal in the vapours rising off the marshes. And in general, Britain was presumed to be blessed with these sort of temperate sea winds that would come in and fan the country and keep the air fresh. Our predecessors were obsessed with fresh air and ventilation, which, kind of coronavirus pandemic has struck me as an interesting historic parallel, because now suddenly we're all throwing open the windows wherever we can to refresh the air around us. But even then, even back in, to answer your question, even back in the 18th century, they were linking periods of unseasonal weather to mass outbreaks of hysteria and depression, although they didn't call it depression. Back then it would be melancholy or hysteria even, or, other words for it. And there's been, obviously, in more kind of recent decades, some studies into this, which I look at in the book. And it's certainly very much seen as the weather is seen, and particularly the darkness. I think the availability of light is seen as a key influencer of mental health. And when we talk about seasonal affective disorder, it's the further north you go, the science has shown it's much further pronounced as a condition.
Thank you so much. This gives me a very interesting point to go into the next question from our audience as well. Just one thing before I do, I wanted to highlight. So there was a heat wave in Athens in 2007, and the temperature recorded was 44.5 degrees, and it was absolutely horrible. And one thing that was very obvious from the discussions in the social media was that those of us that lived in the urban environment, we experienced the heat wave in a much harsher, much more intense way than those that lived in the rural environment. And I do seem to remember a sense of, it actually felt desperation, because you couldn't get away from it. There was nothing you could do to get away from it, because we were too poor to afford any sort of cooling in the house as well. So I'm just going to use that to get into the next question that says, how different the opinions of climate change are between people who live in the urban cities and in rural places. Would you like to give a specific instance? So, because I think this is again something that is very nicely described in the book. Would you like to expand on that?
I mean, what surprised me researching the book was that it's the climate change isn't affecting all parts of the country equally at all. You mentioned the urban areas. We've certainly got, and it's very well documented, this sort of urban heating phenomenon where urban areas are becoming, because of the kind of blanket of pollution around them and everything else, becoming much hotter. And then you've got the sort of the way that particularly some towns are now flooding as well, quite sizable towns that are built around rivers. But also what struck me, and I never knew actually until I read it in parts of my research, was how different parts of the country are heating up differently as well. So in the southeast of England, that is the real sort of epicenter of climate change. So I think temperatures there in the past 50 years or so have gone up by about 2.5 degrees off the top of my head. Well, if you look further north, it's much less than that. In parts of Scotland, it's up about 1 degree instead. And it certainly changes, depending on where you are in the country.
Thank you. I'm going to I'm going to stay on that topic because we seem to be getting a lot of questions about that. So the question is regarding the link between sunshine and light being essential to mental health. And the member of the audience says that there is another book by Adam Atler that counters that by saying it actually dulls the mind to risk and thoughtfulness. How credible are these links between weather and mood science?
I think I think you can certainly say they're credible. There's a whole, in terms of seasonal affective disorder, there's decades of studies that have gone into it. I think it was in Maryland in the US where the research into it first began. I'd certainly say it's credible. in terms of the kind of the darkness and the impact that has on us, I mean, it obviously depends on the person. I have friends who have seasonal affective disorder, and it's I think if you suffer from it, it can be a really sort of terrible thing as you feel the darkness closing in around you. Yeah, I hadn't heard of the other book that he mentioned, but it sounds interesting. It's not something we have to worry about too much in Britain.
That's very funny because whenever I speak to my colleagues and I mention the fact that I'm Greek, they always say that, oh, you must be very used to the sun. And I actually don't like it because it does create to me that effect that was described in the comment. I feel that I'm not supposed to do anything if it's too hot or too sunny, that I just need to sit there and try and survive the heat or the sun.
There was a very famous quote from the war poet Robert Graves, who moved to Mallorca and lived in Dea where he sort of saw out the rest of his life and did his writing there. And I remember he described it as, it's like paradise if you can stand it. And aside from the beautiful weather, the way it actually impacted on his work ethic, and he found it very difficult.
I'm just trying to keep an eye on the time. If there are more questions, please feel free to send them in the chat. There is one question that was posted a while ago, but I wanted to leave it a little bit towards the end. Now, with climate change, being such a huge challenge for humanity, for our planet, but also with quite a lot of other issues, the biodiversity loss or plastics and microplastics. So all of these global challenges and of course regional challenges, like you've been diving into one of those aspects, which is weather. And the question from the audience, which was my question as well, was, did your research make you more gloomy or more hopeful about our future and that of the world?
It's a tough question to answer.
I know, right?
What my research showed me, and what I hadn't fully appreciated, was how climate change is affecting absolutely everything. We think of it, as we think of climate change. When you try and visualize climate change, certainly when I do that, I imagine, a wildfire or a huge flood or something like that. What my research showed to me is how, on a sort of even a relatively benign year or a relatively usual in the sort of scheme of change, of a really sort of speedy change that we're seeing now, how that is being played out in every single aspect of the natural world, and also how everything is interlinked. So we talk of seasonal pulses, which is the moment when a flower emerges, the moment when an insect emerges to feed on that flower, the moment when a migratory bird arrives in Britain to eat that insect, to create the right sort of conditions for it to lay its eggs and rear its young here and stuff. And how all of those are just sort of, these are so finely tuned, and how all of those are just getting intermingled, and all of those are sort of jumbling up and having a massive effect on our wildlife. There was a British Trust for Ornithology study out in 2019 that said climate change is now, it was a long-term study as well, climate change is now affecting a third of British birds. I mention other species in the book, things like adders, for example. I spent a long time with one of our sort of foremost adder researchers, a man called Nigel Hands, going out with him to inspect when adders were coming out of hibernation in the Malvern Hills. His work is finding out that the adders are coming out of hibernation increasingly, or brumation as it's called with the snakes, I should say, coming out increasingly early and into all sorts of unrecognizable weather that's having a terrible impact on their populations. Another critically endangered species in the UK, the dormouse, perhaps a much more loved species than the adder, but that too is suffering terribly in climate change. That has developed beautifully over the seasons in terms of when it emerges from its nest, how it sort of what it eats for its food, how it kind of looks after itself. And now, because it's such a delicate species, if it warms up, we have a warm winter, the dormouse will come out of hibernation early, and there'll be none of the things around for it to eat that it needs to survive. So, populations there are crashing as well. All that was very gloomy, but I suppose what gave me hope, in a sense, is firstly the way that we're developing a much more common ground on this now. When I first started my weather column 8 years ago, it was, there was still a lot of denial that this was even taking place. I mentioned in the book, as well as writing the column, I've sort of covered extreme weather events all over the UK and elsewhere in the world as well. Big wildfires in Portugal, Greece, and so on. And I mentioned a flood, and I'm trying to think of the year. It would have been 2014, I think, when there was a flood in the south of England. It was when David Cameron was Prime Minister. And I remember he sort of turned up in his wellies and, with a load of special advisors around him, as they always do in floods, politicians, and got sort of harangued by local residents. It happened over Christmas, this flood. So, it was a disaster for the village. And all these kind of villagers were haranguing him that he hadn't been out earlier and stuff. And I remember he was there surveying the banks of this river. I can't remember the name of the river off the top of my head. And he said, on camera, these things seem to be happening with a sort of increasing regularity. And that felt like news at the time. The Prime Minister was even going that far to acknowledge that. So I think politically we've come a huge way in just a few years to doing something about this. And I'm hopeful, we've seen it with COVID-19, that when you have international cooperation, you can make progress. We're not seeing enough of that at all in terms of vaccine distribution, but there's progress being made. And I hope the same can be done with climate change. And back to the sort of how analysing the way wildlife adapts as well, apart from those extreme examples of things like adders and dormouse and stuff, it's also shown, watching wildlife up close, it also shows to me that real sort of durability of wildlife as well. And that these are species that have adapted and they can adapt. And what they really need from us to do that is being given the proper space to do that. So, if what we're seeing at the moment is this terrible combination of habitat loss and climate change, all of which is sort of hugely impacting on species. But we can do something about the habitat loss, and we are doing something about that. You see that sort of dialogue is changing. People are asking, what can I do to help support local wildlife? And by creating that space for it, which is something we can all do, then that enables the species to better adapt to what lies ahead for them and these changes. Not all species will be able to get through it, but I'm hopeful for the future. I think you have to be hopeful for the future. And I hope it's a hopeful book as well. I want it to be. I want it to be a book about kind of overcoming adversity, and for a book about sort of not being weighed down by the past, always looking ahead, because I think that's important as well.
Something that I found massively important about your book was the fact that it made me feel less alone in what I've been feeling about climate change and about biodiversity loss and about extreme weather events. And because it would be nice to close on the note of hope. There is one phrase in your book. It says, the report fell largely upon deaf ears. I'm not going to say what report. I'm not going to give any spoilers about the book. But I think that why I felt that phrase was very important in the context of the entire book, of course, is because you write about the swallows and people noticing, the deaths of the swallows. You talk about the event in Greece and other events. You talk about the fires and the wildfires. So I was just wondering if you could just give us your thoughts on turning our common grief over the loss into common hope. Can we do that? How can we do that?
I think I'll maybe go back to the letters that I get from readers. And we live in increasing these sorts of polarized times, increasingly politicized times, really, where it's all about right and wrong, isn't it? It's your side is right and the other person's side is wrong. And that's sort of something that's becoming increasingly fueled over the years as they pass. And I think as much as anything, climate change has become like that as well. Already, my book isn't even out yet, and I'm already getting my fair share of sort of hate mail about it as well, from people saying this is all made up, and which I've had for years through the weather column as well, which is fine, But I think the way of sort of getting that common purpose, as you say, Eleni, is I see it in these letters, is politics are totally removed from it. It's not about politics. It's about what people see and what people experience, what people feel, what people remember. And all of those are uniting things. There's something that brings all of us together. It's a shared experience. And I think tapping into that shared experience, that then gives a sense of common purpose. And it gives a sense of something which really can't be emphasized enough, is we're all in this together, and we all need to find a solution together to make the best. I'm not going to say get out of it, because, you'll know this better than anyone, but to make the best of what lies ahead of us as well. And to do what we can to mitigate that, to protect the poorest of the world, who are most at risk of at the moment, and increasingly so, most at risk of the real sort of extreme weather events, and then to protect all the kind of the wildlife and nature around us that's suffering as well. So I think it's an idea, it's to kind of, let people know that, exactly as you say, we're not alone. We all see this in different ways, and we all may have different opinions about it, which is absolutely fine. But, it's something we can come together about. We all love talking about the weather, as you said at the start. And I think if we can, if we can turn that into a force for good, then we can affect real change as well.
So thank you so very much. We are now 2 minutes before the end, and I would like to sincerely thank you for being with us today, for sharing your thoughts, and for writing this amazing book. And I can see it's in your background, but I'm just going to show it because it has an amazing cover as well. The cover is fantastic. So just a couple of final notes before we close the session today. Again, Joe, thank you very, very much. For our audience, thank you so much for your... Thank you so much, Joe. It was amazing to have you here. And it was really great to see the participation from the audience. Fantastic comments and really, really nice questions from you. As it says in the chat, please remember that the recording will be available. The link is posted in the chat. And if you would like to purchase a copy of Joe's book, I'm pretty sure that this is also added in the chat. And you can find it in the details of today's event. We very, very much hope that you will continue to be engaged with the York Festival of Ideas. Please check out the website for the upcoming sessions and the full details of all the events of the festival program. And please also share your thoughts using the hashtag York Ideas on social media. Thank you all very much for staying with us for a full hour. And again, Joe, thank you very, very much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, and to everybody for such thoughtful questions. I really enjoyed it, and it was a pleasure to be here.
Have a good day and have a good weekend, everyone. And I hope the weather is kind wherever you are.